Welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're wondering if Lebanon could erupt after clashes that killed 2 in Beirut. Pro and anti-Syrian forces, factions, you might say, on tenterhooks. With us to talk about it from Beirut, Mufid Jaber of the Middle East Center. Thank you for being with us. Also with us, Ziad Majed of the American University of Paris and Rouzbeh Parsi of the European Union Institute of Strategic Studies. We're pleased, by the way, to welcome Javier Espinoza, a correspondent in Beirut for the Spanish newspaper El Mundo. Javier, who knows both sides of the border, having been in the past year to places such as Homs. First of all, Javier, night has fallen on Beirut after what happened last night. Are things quiet from what you've seen?
Right now they are quiet, but when I was leaving Akkar in the north, I was in the funeral today of this cleric that was killed yesterday. They were starting to block the roads as well again. So I don't know what is going to happen. There was a lot of anger there.
Did you see this coming?
Well, yes, the political tension is being increasing day by day, and it's very strange because it started in Tripoli with the small clashes, developing huge clashes between these both neighborhoods that have been facing each other for a long time. Then there was the arrest of this other cleric, and then there was the killing of this cleric. So it's something very strange, and many people in the north, especially in Akkar, which is where the Sunni community is concentrated, are claiming that there is a kind of conspiracy which is not proof at all, but they feel like this.
Talk of conspiracy, a radicalization. Have you witnessed a radicalization, an entrenchment, both across the border in Syria and in Lebanon over the past 6 months?
Well, today we saw a lot of militants in Akkar, dozens of them with a lot of weapons shooting in the air. Many of them were Salafi militants, and for the first time in all the years I have been in Lebanon, I heard very harsh words against the army. The army is the last, let's say, establishment that can hold the country together because the country is completely divided through political and sectarian lines. But the army until now was something that everybody was proud about it, and not anymore. These people were just criticizing the army in a way that I never heard before.
We've even heard that some of them have been calling for a Lebanese equivalent of the Free Syrian Army.
Yeah, some critics say so, but that was in a moment of anger. But many of the militants were criticizing the leadership. They were just saying, or the leadership resigned, or they consider them as our enemies. And those were militants with weapons. It's not normal people.
Javier Espinoza, one final question for you. How much would you say, it's just a question about the timing of all of this. The Syrian president, the fact that last week he made a statement warning of a boomerang effect, warning of chaos. Do you think that there's a link?
Well, there is a real link with the Syrian crisis. This, there is no doubt about it. And it's true. I mean, every time he said something about chaos, something happened here. But I mean, there is not the proof that you can say this is 100% true. But the people, as I tell you, the people feel it's really linked to what he's saying. The people, the communities in the north.
Javier Espinoza, I want to thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. Javier Espinoza, the correspondent in Beirut for a Spanish newspaper, El Mundo. We were mentioning just there the words of Bashar al-Assad just last week. He granted an interview, the Syrian president, to Russian television. In it, he stated that in his view, the leaders of Lebanon and Jordan had come around. They'd come to realize how weapons smuggling could trigger a boomerang effect.
If we take into consideration the events in Syria, in Libya, and other countries, it's now clear it isn't spring, but chaos. And as I said, if you have chaos in Syria, it will be contagious.
Mufid Jaber, your reaction when you hear the words of Bashar al-Assad warning of chaos, is this a self-fulfilling prophecy, what we're seeing in Tripoli and Beirut?
You know, it's a very sensitive issue, what's going on in Tripoli. But it would be unrealistic to say that Syria is behind it and to imply that, President Assad, by warning of chaos, is somewhat behind what's happening. But yes, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy, because naturally the events that are happening in Syria are naturally going to spill over into Lebanon. There is a very great risk of there being a civil war similar to what is happening in Syria today, especially when you have people backing the opposition, trying to show force by to make a show of force in Tripoli and Beirut.
Ziad Majed, you agree?
Well, definitely there are Lebanese problems, as we just said, and there are lots of complexities, but I do not separate what's happening today in the north with the Syrian threats that not only in the last interview of Bashar al-Assad, but even before he said it as well. He even said that an earthquake will be all over the region. And I don't buy the accusations of arms smugglers. There are definitely sympathy. There could be some military activities, but I think with the violent repression and the barbaric repression inside Syria, there is a need for the Syrian regime to export its crisis. And with the neighboring countries, there is Iraq, that is an ally, so they will not export anything to Iraq. Jordan, so far the Jordanese borders are well controlled. Israel, the Golan Heights that is occupied since '67 is the most calm front in the region. So, and Turkey, of course, they cannot play with a much stronger actor. So Lebanon is the vulnerable neighbor where they could try to export things, and they have allies in Lebanon. So I think it is not to be disconnected, even if there are enough elements in the Lebanese system to create, unfortunately, lots of tensions.
Rouzbeh Parsi, do you agree that on the part of the Syrian regime there's a need to export the violence?
Well, I'm sure that there are those within the Syrian regime who want to make sure that everyone understands that if they were to fall, everyone will pay. That being said, I think at the same time, without bringing any notion of conspiracy into it, the problem is, in a sense, that Syria and Lebanon have always been wedded together. So whatever happens in one will affect the other. So in that sense, it's not so surprising that you're seeing these things happening in Lebanon as well.
Could the surprise be, in fact, that it hasn't spilled over sooner?
That would actually, yes. In a sense, you could say yes. That's true. But again, as we discussed before as well, I mean, the difference between now and, say, 20 years ago is, of course, that the constellation of forces and the relative strength of the different groups is very different from then. I mean, Hezbollah is, in a sense, a state within a state when it comes to its military capability and organizational structure. It's far outpaces everyone else. So in that sense, it could act both as a stabilizer by staying away to some degree. But of course, if they were to be drawn into whatever is happening now, then the effects will be devastating.
Mufid Jaber, your thoughts on that point. How do you interpret the fact that Hezbollah has, again, we mentioned it in part one, stayed under the radar on this one?
I'm sorry, I have a little trouble hearing you, sir.
I was saying, what is your interpretation of the fact that we haven't heard much from Hezbollah?
Yes, Hezbollah is trying to keep as far away from the conflict as possible. It doesn't want to jeopardize its relations with other people. It doesn't want to draw itself into this civil war, which and it would find confrontation from the Salafis, those supporting the Syrian opposition, if it were to find itself being drawn into what is happening in Syria. So Hezbollah is trying as much as possible to stay away from what's happening in order not to jeopardize and in order not to put itself, to involve itself in internal affairs, and either the internal affairs of Syria, and in order not to to jeopardize its relations with other parties in Lebanon.
Ziad Majed, in this instance, we're looking at foreign forces, Syria, but there are also Gulf states, and many have pointed the finger at them for arming and for backing the Sunni radicals and inside of Lebanon.
I think there are lots of exaggerations about that. In Lebanon, there is one strong military group, that is Hezbollah. And in a confessional context, regardless of how people might feel about the weapons of Hezbollah and the resistance against Israel, this is another issue. But the fact that
Just recently, the U.S. tipped off the Lebanese government to a shipment of arms going to Sunni radicals.
Yes, but once again, when you have in a confessional context one group that is armed, and when there are tensions with others, this might justify calls in other places to create militias as well, especially that in May 7, 2008, there was an internal fight in Lebanon in which Hezbollah used its weapons against its opponents. So this might invite actors, including what you mentioned, Gulf actors, to intervene and to arm some groups in order to create what they call a balance of terror, which is by itself also a terrible thing to happen in the country. But we're not yet there. The issue of the ship, there are lots of also different information about it, whether it was going into Syria in an amateur way or whether it was coming to Lebanon. It's not clear exactly what was happening. But in such a context, with the Sunni and the Shia being throughout the region mobilized by some groups in order to be in a confrontation, or when there are lots of tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or when there are lots of political mobility in terms of actors and alliances, you can expect the worst to happen. But once again, so far in Lebanon, we're not there yet, and I don't think we should exaggerate neither the size or the strength of the Salafists, because among the Sunni community, Hariri is still the strongest, and he's not yet into the weapon issue. And on the Shia side, Hezbollah, as it was said, is still low profile and is avoiding to get into a direct confrontation, even if Sayyid Nasrallah is weakly stating his support for the Syrian regime, which is in many circles decredibilizing him as well. But they are not, except for the discourse, into the confrontation on the involvement, because it will be dramatic on them. And the scenario in Iraq, that is one of the most dramatic in the region, is always to be kept in mind when there are Sunni-Shia confrontations.
Mufti Jaber, when you hear what earlier Javier Espinosa told us when he went up to that funeral, we're getting do you get the feeling that perhaps people like Saad Hariri are getting outflanked by more hardline elements?
Yes, Saad al-Hariri is losing a great deal of his influence on the Sunni community, and many Sunnis are finding recourse in smaller groups, either in Tripoli or in Saida, Ahmad al-Asir, or in Tripoli, Asbat al-Ansar, all of these kinds of groups, which are more radical in their approach, because to them, Hariri has lost his credibility and his ability to effectively lead the Sunni community against what they believe to be the might of Shiite military power. And so they are having recourse to these kinds of groups, the smaller Salafi groups. And it is because of the growing power of these Salafis that they are finding they might mobilize. They are trying to find a way to mobilize against Hezbollah more effectively by having recourse to these kinds of groups instead of Hariri.
Rouzbeh Parsi, do you fear, again, we get back to the essential question of our debate here, that Lebanon could erupt when you hear Mufti Jaber talk about, in this instance, more radical elements gaining ground?
Well, I think so, but perhaps by recourse, by way of Syria. I think some of the things that we're talking about here are still potentials in Syria, in Lebanon, and they've started to become possibly a trend in Syria. And so the question is whether it will come back in a stronger way in Lebanon. Because, I mean, if you look at the Saudis and the Qataris and the others, they have at least vocally been quite strong in their support of the resistance against Bashar al-Assad. And they've at least claimed, and there are rumors, and some people claim to know, that there has been concrete support as well. Now, if that continues, that means, of course, that the group, and I mean, the Saudis, you can say a lot of them, but I mean, they don't have a history of being very choosy about who they give money to. I mean, Afghanistan is a very instructive example in that sense. So I think, if that was to pan out as truthful and be consistently made by them, then of course that will have an effect on Lebanon as well.
Here's what Nadim Houri of Human Rights Watch put out on Twitter a short while ago. He said he was watching footage from last night's fighting. Depressing to see gunmen of all stripes still ruling the streets in the country. What's interesting about that tweet, Ziad Majed, is effectively it's the Lebanese who are armed in the end. It's the Lebanese who are the problem here, perhaps, not the Syrians or the Saudis or anybody else.
Yes, for sure. His tweet is very sincere, and Nadim is a sincere person anyway. But I think there is a large responsibility on the Lebanese themselves. The political system is not functioning well, and there is a strong resistance by the political elite to modify the electoral law, to create administrative decentralization that can weaken clientelism, to think of the confessional formula that's showing lots of deficiencies.
It's existed, since the 1920s?
1926, the constitution and the first electoral system setting the quotas, and the demography is changing, the balance of power is changing. Unfortunately, there are lots of problems, and in the lack of national consensuses, foreign actors can find in Lebanon allies. However, I just want to go back to one important issue, I think, in the political sociology of the Sunni community in Lebanon. We kept saying in the past that weakening Hariri, regardless of how we might evaluate negatively or positively his leadership or his political and economic policies, but his weakening would lead to the emergence of a more radical Sunni force, while Hariri himself is not religious. He might be confessional like all other Lebanese, but he's not religious, while the only religious actor in Lebanon is Hezbollah. So in front of it, the reaction when Hezbollah keeps provoking them after May 2008 and through the discourse and through the militarization, the reaction might become more and more radical on the right of Hariri himself and more into a religious discourse with some jihadi connotation, etc. But we are not yet there. There are once again lots of exaggeration, and I think one Syrian regime objective behind all this is to say and is to try to prove the propaganda that has been repeating for some time, that there is a Salafi conspiracy, a Salafi jihadist tendency in Syria and Lebanon that is to control, and that's why they do not like a factor or a phenomenon like the Hariri or others, or even the Prime Minister today, who are much more liberal than religious. They would like to weaken them, and weakening them is by creating tensions where people frustrated, angry, would look into irrational choices and would call for jihad or for the creation of a Lebanese free army, as it was said in when the Sheikh was killed. All these are much more emotional and can be contained on the ground when there is a political will, and when the will is not, in fact, to feed them and to make them a real monster, so that it will justify weapons on the other side and the Syrian regime propaganda.
Mufti Jaber, we're almost out of time. Do you think Lebanon's politicians will keep a lid on it?
I don't think so. I think it's very possible that this growing Salafi movement is gaining ground in northern Lebanon. And they are heavily backed by Qatar, by Saudi Arabia. They are financially backed, and they are gaining a very large arsenal of weapons. And their ultimate goal is to make it so that northern Lebanon turns into a sort of I wouldn't call it. I would say a sort of something that is similar to what Hezbollah has in the southern suburbs.
All right, so we could face, in other words, that kind of situation. Mufti Jaber, I want to thank you for joining us from Beirut. I want to thank Ziad Majed for being with us, and Rouzbeh Parsi, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.